Hello, everyone just coming in. We're going to give it a couple minutes for people to enter first.
Thanks to everyone waking up early or staying up late to attend. It's really appreciated. Hi, Moga. You can't see participants because we had a lot of registrations, so we decided to organize this as a webinar and not as the usual meeting. And so, yeah, there's a bunch of restrictions on participants in terms of what you can see. Sorry about that, but there was just too much interest, and we couldn't.
There was, 145 registered? But Contain did email everybody, so you know everyone that was registered.
Oh, good point. I didn't even do that on purpose. Sorry, everyone, for doxing all of your emails. Apologies. Magic benefits. All right. All right, we have a few people in. Should we get started?
Sure.
All right, everyone. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you are, on where you are and when you are. I apologize for some potential slurring or rambling. I've came back from a fairly long trip and I've just landed, so I'm not as fresh as I can sometimes be. So today we wanted to hold that time to talk about the pandemic accord. We're reaching the end of negotiations. We'll come to that. And we have found that there's been a lot of engagement of civil society, but not very wide engagement. And so we want to make sure to give a chance to everyone to catch up on what has been happening over the past 2 years, almost a year and a half, and try to help to get that engagement going. So this is our agenda for today. So I'll give us a bit of an introduction and put the pandemic accord / instrument in a bit of context. We'll talk about human rights and inclusion in the pandemic accord, and we have Professor Benjamin Meisenmeyer from University of North California, and Cedric from GNP Plus, that many of you will know. We'll talk about equity in the pandemic accord. That would be Rachel Crockett. Common but differentiated responsibilities. This will be Professor Gopakumar. And finally, we'll talk about medical countermeasure platform in the pandemic accord, and finish on how to engage as civil society and community in the instrument. I'll give a very broad intro, then we'll dive into a lot more of the details during the other presentations. And you'll see that all of the colleagues that we got to talk on the panel are significantly more technically proficient than I am on this. So I'll try to stay at a very high level for my intro, and you'll get the complementary information from the rest of the panel. So without further ado, let's talk a bit about the pandemic accord negotiations. So a bit of context. So there's a lot of jargon. Some of you who have engaged in this for a while will know most of it. Apologies if it's a bit boring, but for everyone else, I think it's useful to sort of set the terms. So throughout the pandemic, we found that there was a clear need for new tools to be ready for the next pandemic, in particular to improve collaboration and fill gaps in existing systems. So there was an official procedure that was launched in December 2021, and led to the creation of an international negotiation body. The idea was that INB would meet regularly over the next 2.5, 3 years to negotiate a text to be adopted under the WHO Constitution Article 19. So that's a bit jargony, but what's obvious is that instruments that are accepted under that article are binding to member states. So the current wording to describe the pandemic accord is a convention agreement of other international instruments, because there's still a number of discussions ongoing on how binding the final text will be. And so that wide array of terms used to describe it reflect the wide scope of those discussions and some amount of disagreements. So we know we have a bit of an idea of what will be the content of the final text since February this year. So when the conceptual zero draft was released, it was broad agreement that it was a strong document in the sense that he had a bit of everything in it. There was a lot of potential, but it was also clear that it was not particularly coherent, and that there would have to be a number of choices made throughout the negotiation process. And in fact, we saw the proposed negotiation text released in November. So that was after 6 full rounds of negotiation by the AMB, and that text is quite different. I think we can agree, and we'll come back to that, that it's weaker in a lot of ways than the conceptual zero draft, which is to an extent to be expected, because as we said, the zero draft was very wide, but in a number of crucial cases, the weaker option was chosen in that text. So the IND will finish its work and propose the final text to be put for adoption at the World Health Assembly in May 2024. So in 6 months now. And I mentioned six full rounds of negotiations. There will be a total of 9 rounds of negotiation of the international negotiating body. And we're currently in the middle of round 7, which will finish at the beginning of December, and will be followed by 2 more next year. So, sorry, I had to go through that pretty quickly. I'm just going to put a couple of links in the chat just for reference to the conceptual zero draft and to the original timeline for the negotiations. And onward we go. So I'm trying to talk, I'm going to give just a little bit of context in terms of what the text tries to achieve, but as I said, we'll come back to give a lot more details around this broad category. So at the very top level, looking at the content of the current draft, what the draft seems to want to achieve is, on the one hand, broadly strengthen global preparedness. There's a lot of talk about how to improve surveillance, system strengthening, and workforce training in particular. Promote adequate financing of preparedness and better planning for response, and how that financing is going to be done is still a bit blurry. Create new avenues for monitoring progress at the country level, which is probably where the current text, and that's my opinion, is perhaps the clearest and probably the strongest. And then create more systematic channels for easier access to pandemic tools, including strengthening supply chains across globally, a number of intellectual property provisions, and other means of promoting access. I'm staying very vague about this because we'll come back to that several times during this call, but it's extremely disputed, and a lot of the current disagreements around the text are really centered on that part of it. And so, just to frame where the pandemic accord/instrument fits into the broader pandemic preparedness and response efforts of the past few years, we had many initiatives that were born of the COVID-19 pandemic. They are somewhat linked, or at least have become somewhat linked. We had the ACTE and COVAX that was created during COVID to facilitate coordination, and now is meant has now ended both, and is meant to be replaced by a medical countermeasure platform. We'll talk about that a bit later. There's the revision of the international health regulation, which is somewhat similar to the pandemic accord, but concerns existing text rather than the creation of new one. There's the pandemic accord. There's the pandemic fund, which is meant to finance a lot of in-country strengthening of pandemic preparedness, with some lack of clarity on how the pandemic fund is going to be linked with the pandemic accord and the international health regulation. And there was the high-level meeting that took place this year, and that was hoped to create some sort of a roadmap and an idea of how these different initiatives were going to become coherent. But that's not really what happened in September, and the main outcome was probably an agreement to meet again later. And then, thanks, Brooke, there's a number of additional initiatives in the G7, in the G20, et cetera, et cetera. Those were the ones that have been the most on my radar recently, but I think people in different parts and bubbles of the global health world have finding a lot of different ones. So the point in terms of the importance of civil society engagement in pandemic preparedness is that these are the structures, and these, and more, as Brooke pointed out, are the structures that will shape a response to the next pandemic, and they will have ripple effects throughout global health. We can't stay out of these conversations, and we have a lot of expertise to contribute, in particular because a lot of instruments are currently hitting dead ends or are being watered down because we're in a very tense international environment, and it's extremely complicated to get any sort of consensus on anything, which is a real problem. And as civil society being, on the outside of a lot of these disputes, I think we need to keep pushing to make sure that these different initiatives, come to fruition and are actually useful and productive. But we also need to promote coherence and integration across instruments. So a number of different donors promote different initiatives for various reasons. And I think it's important. We know the burden for implementers of that kind of fragmentation, and we really need to push back against it. So this is my pitch. Now we'll go to those more focused conversations. Coming back to the agenda, and we'll first hear from Benjamin and Cedric on human rights inclusion in the pandemic accord. And to let you share, I will stop sharing my slides. Benjamin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I am just looking at how to share my screen here. Perfect.
Working.
So it's been inspiring to see this wide range of reforms happening, and they're all happening exceptionally rapidly. And so I hope to provide some sense of how human rights have been developed within the specific context of the pandemic accord, and how advocacy to advance human rights has evolved over the past 2 years. And so it's a pleasure to join you today. My name is Benjamin Meyer. I'm a professor of global health policy at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm a senior scholar at the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law, and I'm the chair of the Global Health Law Consortium, bringing together legal faculty throughout the world to analyze these issues of global health, and have been instrumental in analyzing some of these reforms. And working alongside the International Commission of Jurists, it's been really inspiring to work with the Civil Society Alliance on Human Rights and the Pandemic Treaty to examine ongoing human rights concerns in the Pandemic Accord, and specifically to consider necessary reforms that could be undertaken to strengthen human rights over the past 2 years and now in the final months. And with states seeking to finalize the revisions of the international health regulations and the development of the Pandemic Accord by May 2024, these have been busy months among a series of other reforms inside and outside of the UN system. But in focusing on the Pandemic Accord, we see this unique opportunity to learn from the human rights challenges of the COVID-19 response, and to really establish human rights obligations that will be necessary to meet future threats. It's been really inspiring to support the Civil Society Alliance and its advocacy over the past 2 years with our analyses that are published on the CSA website, and I hope someone can share it in the chat. Our analyses really tracing, as Quentin said, the weakening of human rights commitments throughout the negotiating process, as the intergovernmental negotiating body has stepped back from many of the previous advancements on human rights and neglected crucial opportunities to mainstream human rights in these global health law reforms. As we approach the final negotiations in the coming months, these INB debates will provide a crucial opportunity for civil society to advance human rights in global health law. in helping us to establish human rights obligations to meet future threats, whether by explicitly incorporating obligations from international human rights law or by implicitly referencing human rights norms and principles. And so I think we can begin to talk about the ways in which we've been fighting this fight for a good long time. And in introducing this conversation on the reforms to mainstream human rights throughout the pandemic accord, I hope to just briefly speak about the need for human rights in this global health law reform, to focus on and review some of the previous analyses of civil society efforts to advance human rights in the INB negotiations, and then to think about with all of you some of the critical reforms that will be necessary to strengthen human rights. And I hope that this analysis, like those that we've developed over the years, can provide a human rights foundation for civil society advocacy in these final months of INB negotiations. And so beginning in the need for human rights, we recognize the ways in which the pandemic treaty provides a crucial foundation to develop human rights obligations to strengthen global health law and to overcome, as I said earlier, the human rights limitations that were exposed by the COVID-19 response. In developing human rights analyses of the pandemic response, both for the IPPPR and for focusing on civil society advocacy, we've examined the ways in which human rights were affected by the response to the pandemic, detailing challenges to the right to health and public health system preparedness, in focusing on the social and economic rights of vulnerable groups, especially during extended lockdowns or quarantines. We've looked at the limitations of civil and political rights to promote public health, recognizing the ways in which governments have often used public health as a justification to repress populations. And we focused, as was mentioned in the introduction, on obligations of international assistance and cooperation, the ways in which governments undermine the common response to this shared threat and weakened our vaccine equity efforts. In many ways, these violations have revealed inequities in global health governance. They've weakened the global response. They've raised an imperative for human rights strengthening in this pandemic accord. As we learn from these human rights violations, the Civil Society Alliance on Human Rights in the Pandemic Treaty has looked to human rights to guide the participatory process of treaty negotiations, pressing for meaningful civil society engagement. The Civil Society Alliance has focused on the substantive obligations of the treaty text, many of which we'll discuss today, and is focused specifically on treaty oversight arrangements and the ways in which we can ensure accountability for these human rights commitments in the pandemic accord. And civil society looks to these human rights obligations to ensure that states don't lose sight of human rights as we begin to focus on the ways in which we've developed, human rights analyses over the past 2 years. For those who've been there since the beginning, the Civil Society Alliance was launched in December 2021, just after the development of the idea of a pandemic accord. The Civil Society Alliance has engaged with these negotiations to develop the pandemic accord, to call on the INB to recognize the inextricable linkages between public health and human rights. Before any text was developed, the CSA sought to frame INB debates at the very launch of the CSA, developing a set of 10 human rights principles for a pandemic treaty, detailing the human rights norms to be considered when drafting, negotiating, and implementing the new treaty. To build support for civil society engagement, the CSA developed an initial campaign to draw attention to the limitations of civil society participation in the treaty development process, and to recognize that civil society is uniquely situated to contribute the perspectives of right holders. CSA has continued to engage with the INB, systematically participating in open meetings where permitted, engaging in technical intercessional work, providing written feedback on working drafts, and these efforts have sought to mainstream human rights norms and principles in the obligations of the treaty itself. In elaborating these human rights principles, the International Commission of Jurists worked with the Global Health Law Consortium over the past 3 years to develop what you see here at the bottom, these principles and guidelines on human rights in public health emergencies, to elaborate for all stakeholders the international legal standards that exist in these public health emergencies, and to provide a basis for extending human rights in the pandemic accord and other parallel reforms taking place across the international system. And in drawing from these principles, our working group of the CSA has really sought to develop a series of analyses of human rights limitations. First in the zero draft, then in the working draft, then in the bureau draft, and now in the negotiating draft. And throughout these analyses, we've sought to recognize the ways in which international human rights law needs to move beyond its recognition of the preamble and introductory sections, and the ways in which we need to mainstream international human rights norms and principles for public health prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery. In these analyses, we've sought to look at the ways in which the right to health can provide a foundation for maintaining core public health capacities. We sought to look at the ways in which we can talk about rights-based principles in pandemic responses. We've thought about human rights obligations for underlying determinants of health, the ways in which human rights can structure restrictive measures where necessary in emergency context. We focused on global solidarity and supporting international cooperation, and we've looked to access to technology in a global response. This is the foundation of many of our focuses today. The ways in which we can talk about the legal foundations of the right to health, whether in the WHO Constitution or as expanded by international human rights law. The ways in which we can talk about the right to health and its attributes of availability, accessibility, acceptability, and quality in both healthcare and underlying determinants of health. To focus on our necessary article on the protection of human rights in the pandemic accord. As we begin to focus on the centrality of human rights from the WHO Constitution to the present day, how do we ensure that these human rights are mainstreamed throughout the pandemic accord? It's been in many ways frustrating for advocates and academics studying this to recognize that the robust language on the protection of human rights in early drafts was lost. But how do we move beyond that? Not simply to replace what was lost, but to recognize the need for human rights principles throughout. The pandemic accord provides new opportunities in these uncertain times to really strengthen human rights obligations, to make up for the losses during the pandemic, and to strengthen our human rights foundations in global health. And yet the early drafting process has really exposed the threat that human rights could be lost again in our efforts to respond to future pandemics. And so I look forward to this discussion of human rights priorities for civil society advocacy and considering ways in which academic partners can develop analyses to support this advocacy in the months to come. These coming months will be crucial in determining the future of human rights in global health. And I hope that they provide a foundation for our collective response to future pandemic threats. Thank you for letting me be a part of this conversation. And I look forward to our continuing support for civil society as these reforms develop in the coming months. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Benjamin. Cedric, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thanks, Quentin, and thanks a lot for Benjamin for providing the analysis. I guess my point in adding to what Benjamin was saying, I would like to, I think first of all, to everyone's surprise that we are leaving probably the reason why this agreement has been developed. We are forgetting that we're learning from the experience of COVID, where the reason why we have this agreement is to look into people's health and address the needs of the population while we're responding to pandemics. So my contribution maybe from our analysis, there's 2 points I want to highlight here. The first one is related to access to health services for general population, but also for people living with health conditions or marginalized population or vulnerable population, as they call them, but also issues related to stigma and discrimination. In details, I think what we learned from the COVID-19 time is that if you take the example, for instance, of people living with HIV, there has been reported cases where access to life-saving treatment were interrupted due to lockdown or other restrictions related to preventing the spread of COVID. And in the current text, negotiating text, also in the previous one, we still see the issues related to maintaining or ensuring access to health services is still not really clear. So what we have is access to essential health services. And as you can imagine, when we are in pandemic times, what is normally essential services are no longer essential services in certain way. The provision, especially in the article number 6, where it's where there's a provision on continuity of health services, essential health services maintained, we still lack the emphasizing on ensuring access to services to those that already have other conditions or who their life are put on threat to death because of the lack of these services. So when we talk about human rights in general, we're also thinking about what the pandemic response is. What is the pandemic agreement addressing when we talk about people who have chronic health conditions in relation to the experience we already have? So we cannot talk about essential health services and not talking about access to essential services to those who live with chronic conditions. And we still miss this in the previous text and the current text as well. It's only, we barely have I think one line that's really mentioned country, encouraging country wherever is appropriate should continue to provide quality essential health services. So I think that's one thing that is really missing, and we are missing the centrality on human. It's only focusing on strengthening the system, but we're not thinking about what is the system need to be made for. And in this case, I think you also mentioned it, Benjamin, the right to health, but also for us, most importantly, the right to health during and in pandemic times. The second thing, I guess, I would like really to mention here, Quentin and everyone else, maybe to also draw attention for everyone to help us keep pushing for there's no mention in any case on any provision that would address the needs, the human right needs for marginalized or vulnerable populations. And we had it in the Bureau's text, I think in June, but then in the current text, it also disappeared. So we don't have, we're still lacking at least an intention or a recommendation towards making sure that the human rights or discrimination of marginalized or vulnerable population is also taken into consideration when we respond or prevent a pandemic. So I guess my point here that 2 things from the Bureau's text in June and the current text, the negotiating text, there's a lack of focus on what humans needs at the first place, as opposed to what country need to do. And there's a lot of, instead of encouraging country to make commitments, there's a lot of I would say, I mean, and every country has freedom, but country are encouraged to take decision based on their current national registration, and there's a lack of maybe asking country to take commitments towards looking at people at the center, but also looking at the basic human rights and looking at what need to be done during pandemic time, but also inter-pandemic times. I guess the issue on access to services for people who already have issues to access those services, even without pandemic, is not readdressed, and we've learned this from COVID. And lastly, issues about stigma and discrimination. We have a mention on vulnerable population, but we don't have any provision that say, how do we protect the vulnerable population in pandemic time and during inter-pandemic time? There's no kind of provision, and we seems like we are not learning from COVID, but we are actually making new provisions that are not really responding to the issues we have when the idea of developing the pandemic was first came, as you mentioned, Quentin. So I would conclude and saying any voice that we need to put forward should look into human right, but also going deeper. What kind of provision do we have to protect or to promote right to health during pandemic time, but also inter-pandemic times? Thank you. I will stop there, Quentin.
Thanks a lot, Cedric. I just want to remind everyone to use the Q&A section function and the chat if you have any questions for the panelists, and we'll come back to that during the Q&A at the end. Saying this, Rachel, do you want to go ahead with your presentation on the equity articles in the pandemic report?
Yes. Hi. Let me just start sharing. Wonderful. I assume everyone can see that. Good. Okay. Well, firstly, thank you for having me, having DNDi within these discussions. It's been fascinating also to listen to the previous two speakers. So thank you for that. For those who don't know us, we're DNDi, so Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative. So we are a not-for-profit R&D organization that discovers, develops, and accelerates access to drugs for neglected populations. So we have done some work in COVID in terms of some large adaptive clinical trial platforms, and some discovery work for research as well. So we have some experience in PPR R&D, and we also have a lot of experience in R&D for neglected populations and what needs to be done differently. So before, one second. Why is that? Here we go. I think I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think a lot of the previous speakers have also done this, but I just wanted to take us a step back to why it's so critical that we're even negotiating this as an instrument. Why are we here in the first place? Because over the course of the negotiation, as was said, this has been going on for almost 2 years now. It's very easy, especially now where it's getting into the really quite aggressive stages of the negotiation, to forget, when you're going into what the drafting languages is and are word for word, that kind of thing, it's very easy to forget. So this is just a slide from a policy report that we did during COVID a couple of years ago. And I think the title really helps frame some of this. So was COVID just another triumph of science, which it was, but defeat for access, which I think it absolutely was. And this is exactly why we need to fight for equity in this process in the first place. So COVID was an acute example of a chronic problem. I think this is the thing. COVID wasn't just a once-off. We know that there is a chronic problem in the way that we develop develop drugs or develop health tools. Our innovation system for global health, there is a chronic problem within this that COVID really shone a light on. And I think if we, this treaty provides an opportunity to fix some of these issues, but only if we learn some of these lessons. Some of these lessons, only some. That there was limited participation by low middle income countries in setting the research agenda. There was very limited open sharing of research knowledge and data. Health tools were often restricted within intellectual property. There was clearly not enough or sufficient production. The equitable allocation just didn't exist. Affordable pricing was an issue. So those are some of the real key issues that were very stark in COVID, but we also know clearly that they are a chronic problem and a symptom of a system that isn't performing as it needs to. So in terms of what needs to change, we need this kind of long-term reorientation of PPR. And I think some of this stuff, we need to guarantee political attention, financing of end-to-end R&D and access for pandemics, that is clear priority given to areas that are most likely to be neglected by the market. We need to reimagine this global health R&D coordination and collaboration, and to support this much more distributed, decentralized, democratic approach to both the production of knowledge and innovation, and then access to the health products that result from it. And that we need to ensure that there are these globally agreed norms and binding rules that govern this process, to ensure that the benefits of all the scientific progress will be equitably shared for all. And I think it's fair to say that the Accord process is not a perfect one by any means, but to be frank, it is the only process, as well as the International Health Regulation Amendment process, that is talking about binding rules for some of this stuff, to ensure that future responses are driven with the guiding principle of equity. So I just have two quick slides which pictorially, I suppose, show the process of what we call an end-to-end R&D and access, so from bed to bench side. Because I think it shows that, the first slide here, that this process is a relay race, and you're kind of going from the different stages of development. And we know that in each of these stages of development, key decisions are being made that can hinder access, that can facilitate access. And who gets to make those decisions is absolutely key for this process. And the second slide is the R&D process as a kind of end-to-end picture there, showing all the different aspects of R&D and access that need to be addressed if you want to ensure both the development of a health tool, but also equitable access to the product in the end. So this includes priority setting, all the way from priority setting at the beginning to surveillance, to genome sequencing and data sharing, discovery research, clinical development, regulatory policy, manufacturing, production, procurement, distribution, patient access. All of this needs to be, can and should be addressed within the Accord in some way. But it's also critical that the Accord delivers on this enabling environment that surrounds this end-to-end R&D and access process. So things like upfront agreed norms and binding rules, predictable and sustainable financing, scientific and technical collaboration and coordination, and inclusive and equitable government structures. So I think we know that there's a lot of public money going into into PPR in general, both right now and will be in the future. And we think that this really does present an opportunity to use that leverage of that funding to accelerate research, to operationalize equity within the Accord. And the Accord really does have an ability to address all, or many, if not all, I suppose, of these issues. And we're talking about, I've been asked to speak about how equity is, how some of the equity provisions are coming out in this Accord. So I just thought it's quite helpful to show, when we're talking about equity, quite often the negotiators are talking about Article 9 through to 13, which focuses on R&D, production, tech transfer, access and benefit sharing, and supply chain. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about embedding equity into this process. So I'm going to run through quickly what the state of play is for many of these provisions, which seek to, I suppose, operationalize the equity principle. As I've said, I'm mainly going to focus on Article 9, which is on R&D, Article 10 and 11, which is on sustainable production and tech transfer, and then Article 12, which is talking about access and benefit sharing. There really is not enough time to go in a 10-minute presentation to go into a lot of detail on this, but I'm trying to pull out some of the key components here so that maybe we can have a discussion in the Q&A, or to maybe just highlight where some of the areas that might be worth looking into in more detail. And I know that many people on this call are also working on many aspects of these provisions and articles, and we really encourage on the chat, the Q&A, and during the Q&A at the end to please come in where I've no doubt missed things. So in terms of R&D, there has been a removal of provisions to attach conditions on public funding. So governments, what are conditions? So governments, I suppose, have this opportunity to use the leverage. They're providing funding for R&D, and they're providing funding, obviously, to purchase the end products. So they have an opportunity to use this leverage to embed equity into the agreements, into the funding agreements, by agreeing to impose some upfront terms and conditions. And the Pandemic Accord is an opportunity to agree collectively that public funders will do this together collectively. High-income countries, middle-income countries, low-income countries, as long as they are funding R&D, will all commit, or should all commit, to be attaching conditions for access conditions and also conditions that speed up the R&D process in the first place. So these conditions, I mean, some of the things they could include, open sharing of knowledge, open sharing of research inputs, processes, outputs, affordability criteria, pro-access IP management, allocation obligations, depending on what it is that they're funding. So what's happened to this? In the zero draft, there was this provision to attach conditions that was removed in the Bureau's text, and still has not been reinstated in this negotiating text, despite calls from so many member states to include this, including the co-facilitators, Mexico and Norway, of the R&D informals. They proposed this after the 19 hours of negotiation they had over summer on the R&D article. They proposed that there is not obviously concrete agreement on the provision itself, but there absolutely is agreement that it should be in there to start the negotiation process. And the Bureau has maybe somewhat unilaterally decided that that is not going to be in, because what we've heard is that they think it's too much of a contentious issue and will take us past the May 2024 deadline. So make of that what you wish. So I think what's happened is that it was merged with or conflated with a provision to publish contract terms, so transparency on contract terms. Now, absolutely agree that that is a provision that should be within the accord, but that doesn't mean just because you publish your contract terms doesn't mean that you're going to attach pro-access terms in the first place to that funding. So you need both. You need the transparency and you need the conditions in the first place. And this is important because the IP waiver is in there. We'll speak about that in a minute. There's an access and benefit sharing provision, which we'll speak about in a minute too. They are necessary, but they are not sufficient as they're currently written to cover all the needs and cover all the bases. So, and we know what from COVID, what's at risk when there is no safeguards in place, when government funders use taxpayers' money to fund R&D with no recourse at the end if they need to do if in a pandemic situation or when a public health emergency of international concern is declared, they have zero safeguards now, the majority of funders, to actually do anything with the products that they have funded in the first place. So this is about having safeguards. Another just quick point on the R&D article is that there is it's very focused on later stages of R&D rather than all stages that are needed for preparation and response. And again, this is despite many member state proposals saying we need to widen this focus. We need to include early stage collaboration. There's still no provisions relating to our early stage R&D activities, so they're missing. Okay, so in terms of Articles 10 and 11, which is the sustainable production and then the technology transfer articles, so there are some positive elements. there are some positive aspects of transparency in licensing and tech transfer agreements. There is a new provision on sharing trade secrets. There's aspects of transparency of public procurement agreements, of pricing and costs, and discouraging confidentiality agreements. There is a reference provision there about the use of using TRIPS flexibilities, which is important in case voluntary measures are not available. There's a provision about the non-exclusive licensing of government-owned technologies, and that could probably be strengthened to include government-funded technologies, not just government-owned technologies, because not that many governments own the technologies that they fund. And that there is a health technology access pool in all but name, pooling. There's references there to a mechanism to pool relevant IP and data, promote relevant transfer of technology. However, there's significant shortfalls within this, within the way that it's written. In Article 10 and 11, there is a massive reliance on the words kind of encouragement, promotion, or other voluntary approaches. And there's really no explicit obligations for the majority of the provisions. It's kind of very shrouded in terms such as appropriate, encourage, etc., which are just surrounded by ambiguity, which will not take us any further and change the status quo than what we had in COVID. Okay, so in terms of the access and benefit sharing article, Article 12, there is this establishment of a PAB system, so a pathogen access and benefit sharing system. Very, very top line. There's a very clear obligation there to share on countries to share materials, to share pathogens, to share the genomic sequencing, etc. But there's hardly any clear reciprocal kind of product access benefits from sharing those materials. Beyond, in a pandemic, that they will supply 20% to the WHO on a basis that 10% is a donation and 10% is at an affordable price. That assumes that the WHO has funds to be able to procure, which is not a given, considering where the financing aspects are. That is the only real clear obligation. The others are talking about you may consider other benefit sharing options, such as transferring the technology to developing country manufacturers, maybe considering something about tiered pricing. It's very clear there is nothing about trying to increase the pie, increase the supply. It's only talking about we have a small pie and this is a small piece of the pie which goes to the WHO for worldwide allocation. So it's clearly not strong enough. So I'm gonna stop there. I've got one more slide, but I would suggest I put the link, and we can share these slides. So I put the link to the IMB website, which has many written statements by many stakeholders and non-state actors who have submitted written statements to the process for the November IMB 7 meeting. And I would really encourage you to read some of those, because they go into a lot more detail than what I was able to cover. So this final slide is just kind of what's the state of play now between the November IMB meeting and the next IMB negotiation meeting, which happens in the 4th to the 6th of December. So in terms of content, the November meeting, I mean, I'm sure many of you will have seen, but if not, it's recorded and live streamed on the WHO IMB website. It's worth just maybe having a look at some of the plenary statements by some of the countries. So it was very clear, intellectual property was front and center in so many of the high-income country plenary statements, the Global North statements. Things like WHO is not a place to discuss these issues. That needs to be done in WTO and WIPO. This is our red line, and really, really took this to probably, in my opinion, a very unnecessary level at this point. And Ellen Tahone has just done a piece in Health Policy Watch this week talking about the long history that WHO has working on IP issues to try and dispel this myth. So it's worth reading that. Other issues that kind of came out content-wise in the plenary, the Global South criticised mostly kind of lack of binding equity provisions, as we've just discussed, the removal of really, really strong CBDR, which I know Gopa's speaking to in a minute, removal of conditions on public financing, which I covered. And I would say that the group on equity, which has been a small group of, well, not small, maybe about 30 to 40 countries of the South, coming together to discuss and put in joint proposals, etc. They have never really managed to be as strong together as they were in IMB7. They put together text proposals, they did group statements, so they're really coming out strong now, and they are aligning with the African group really, really well. So quite often they're putting in joint proposals by the group on equity and the African group. So they're having that's a lot of countries coming together saying the same thing, which is really is great to see. Two other points are that there's been a lot of issues in the negotiating text that are postponed until future conferences of the parties. So the idea for the governance of this mechanism of the accord is that there will be these COPs like you have in the kind of Paris Agreement and climate, and you will in the text, some of the provisions are saying by 2025 COP, by 2026 COP, we will have agreed X, Y, Z. So it's really pushing a lot of issues, mostly a lot of the contentious issues, to future COPs, which is not a great idea. But many of the countries also, especially Brazil and a couple of others, called out the discrepancies between this, because some of the issues that the global north in particular are interested in, the One Health stuff, the prevention stuff, surveillance, articles 4 and 5, not much of that gets postponed until future COPs. However, much of the work in 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 gets postponed until future COPs. So that is starting to be called out, and it's just worth noting. And then finally, there's some questions on how the text was developed, the negotiating text. I alluded to it before, but many of the textual proposals from the co-facilitators across the different groups, not just Article 9, have not been included. And this has had a really detrimental effect on equity provisions within the accord. In terms of what's happening now, many proposals are being put back in. So there is now another long on-screen text, which is being dubbed the compilation text 2. Politico did a publication of that, so you can see what countries have said what and what they're pushing for. There are now informal working groups between now and December, but note there is no formal working group on 9, which is R&D, or 13, which is supply chain. So will they be discussed? Very unlikely, especially the R&D article, which is quite disappointing, because not only is that some of the most concrete ways to operationalize equity left undiscussed, really, but it also misses these opportunities to link with the articles 10, 11, 12 plus, because you can't, these all link together. These could all really be one article if you wanted to, and they can't really be discussed in isolation. So the IMB7 continues in December, 4th to the 6th. So we will see what happens at that point. But I'll stop there because I want to have some good discussions at the Q&A. So thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. I was wondering whether to jump in time-wise, but it was really, really informative, and I think a really good basis for the rest of the conversation. So thanks a lot. It was a great presentation. Without pushing that back any further, Gopal, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. Yeah. I will not take much time, and thank you for the invite and for this opportunity to share some thoughts on these the CBDR. One of the valid criticisms on the existing health emergency regime is that it's a colonial legacy. Why it is being called as a colonial legacy or continuing colonial elements in the health emergency regime is primarily due to one reason, that is that the health emergency regime as of now, that's primarily through the international health regime. That's if you consider the regime as only a legal instrument, then international health regulation is the legally binding instrument, which creates an obligation for all the countries to provide information about the outbreaks, and then that information then goes to WHO, and WHO then takes an ultimate call whether to declare a PHEIC or not. That's a public health emergency of international concern. But as soon as the PHEIC is declared, then the countries who provide such information is by and large left high and dry, because there is no legal guarantee that these countries will get assistance, especially to effectively respond to this outbreak. Often, due to various reasons, including the biodiversity and the climatic conditions, most of this outbreak happens in the global south. And it's also to keep it in mind that these countries have um, do not have the technological ability to produce some of these health products required for the uh, uh, public health response to such outbreak. So as a result, in practical terms, the IHR regime will help the northern countries to get the information in time and to take measures. And there is no corresponding legal obligation to provide assistance. So it does not mean that assistance never takes place. Assistance does take place, but it is outside the legal regime and at the on a charity basis or on a humanitarian gesture. So as a result, there is no legal guarantee that the countries who provide the information will get assistance. So in this regard, we also keep it in mind that the obligation in IHR to provide this information, every country has two other obligations, important obligations. There are other obligations, but two important obligations we should keep in mind. The first obligation is to maintain core capacity in surveillance, and second, to maintain a set of core capacity in public health response. But the IHR does not recognize the development divide. That means the asymmetry existing in terms of financial and technological abilities required to maintain such core capacities. As a result, both the developed and developing countries are treated at an equal footing. In a way, you can say that developing countries have undertaken obligations which they are not in a position to fulfill. If you look at the the SPAR reports, which basically puts the various capacities in the context of IHR, you will find the global capacity as of now. The core capacities in various areas related to IHR is around 65%, and there are Africa region, CRO region, etc. Goes below the global average. So therefore, it is important to correct this asymmetry. So how do you do this? Therefore, it is important to introduce a CBDR, that is common but differentiated responsibility in the public health regime when we are reforming IHR, as well as negotiating for a new pandemic instrument. What is CBDR? CBDR is a principle existing in the environmental law, which basically recognizes that everybody has a common responsibilities, but certain actors have to undertake more responsibility to implement, to achieve these common responsibilities, precisely because there are actors who do not have the ability to fulfill their obligations due to the development divide, and various other elements, including the historical responsibility in the case of environmental law. So, it is important to recognize the development divide in the international public health context or international health emergency context. Therefore, there is a demand to recognize CBDR explicitly in the context of IHR as well as in the pandemic instrument. If you look at the rationale for doing that, is it's simple. One is equity, so I don't have to explain the lack of equity in the health in the health emergency regime. Second, fairness. You cannot treat unequals equally. If in the absence of that fairness, often countries would be forced to undertake obligations which they are not in a position to fulfill. So and third. The third element is basically as a means of implementation. If you are looking at these are the global public health these are global public goods, whether it's climate change or pandemic. So we need to have a some kind of assistance for implementing it in a fair, equitable manner, along with by providing a means of implementation. So having said this, let me now just quickly move to the what does it entail in the IHR context as well as in the pandemic context. I think developing countries need the three things. The first thing is that whenever they undertake this obligation, there should be some kind of means to implement those in terms of technology, access to technology and resources. And second, there should be much more transition period, longer period of time for the full implementation of these provisions. And lastly, there should be an obligation on the part of the developed countries to provide technology and financial resources to have to help the developing countries to implement it properly. This is not new. Actually, this is already existing in the UNFCCC context. The full implementation of the obligations of developing countries under UNFCCC depends upon the availability of finance and technology from the developed countries. So therefore, it is important to have the similar provisions here to achieve much more and to achieve a regime which is based on mutual cooperation and trust as well as solidarity. So now the last point is that the critic are pointing out that there is no historical responsibility, therefore there is no applicability of CBDR here. That's not true exactly. And second criticism is that it's an environmental law concept, therefore there is limited scope for this principle in the public health context. Both are not true. If you look at the historical responsibility and the environmental issue, much of the pandemic threats or even health emergency threat are going to come from the climate change and loss of biodiversity, the zoonotic spillovers going to happen. So it's by and large from the environmental context. And historical responsibility, we know that very much that climate change has an historical context, and also colonialism has a major role in shaping the health systems in the developing countries. So now I'll take around 2 more minutes and stop it, maybe 1.5 minutes. So if you look at whether there is any recognition of this development divide in IHR, of course, Article 44 and even Article 5, where there are mentions about the need for assistance to developing countries. Then what's the problem now? The problem is that it has not put the responsibility on the people who are having the resources to provide that assistance. So it's please say generally all parties shall cooperate to assist developing countries in particular. So that you will see in the draft negotiating text, Article 4, Article 5, and Article 6, even Article 7, you may find the similar language. The problem is that it has not put the responsibility, or it has not creating any obligations on countries who are having the means to provide that. So that's a problem that needs to be corrected. And let me stop it here. I'm happy to participate in the discussion.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Gopal. Really important and really useful presentation. I'm just going to ask anyone in attendance, if you have any questions for the panel, can you raise your hand so we have a sense of how long we want to set aside for the conversation? And we'll move on with the presentations on the basis of that. I'll be a bit more ruthless with the last two presentations in terms of timekeeping. Sam, do you want to tell us about the MCM platform?
Sure thing. So since the beginning of the year, the WHO has undertaken an exercise to develop options for a prototype of a medical countermeasures platform, or a continuation of the ACT-A platform that ran during the acute phase of the COVID-19 pandemic. Recognizing a lot of the pitfalls of ACT-A, particularly in equity and delivery of medical countermeasures, CSOs that have been involved in this process have been forcefully advocating for changes to the platform to better deliver on its promises. Though many months of work have been done, member states got spooked by WHO's leadership on this process and directed the team to instead simply map gaps so that member states could work out negotiations on the platform through what is now Article 13 in the Pandemic Accord. So for this section, I'll just briefly summarize civil society views on what needs to change for the platform, and then what is missing in Article 13. So firstly, there needs to be a lot more work on consensus for broad country commitments. While there are several proposals for such a platform from WHO, from Norway and South Africa, who have led a separate process, from the G20, from G7, it's unclear that any particular presentation has the buy-in of all of countries. Country commitments on the platform are crucial and should inform all proposed aspects, from larger decisions, such as whether the platform might shepherd resources, to smaller ones, such as the frequency of working group meetings. Without robust support from heads of state or legislative bodies, the platform will be misdirected and ineffectual. Of particular concern, it is as of yet unclear to the extent to which countries are in support of the platform's existence at all, much less the details of how it will be financed, run, and what the scope of its activities would be. All these different proposals are currently being hashed out at the multilateral or bilateral level, and these will be presented to member states in different formats, but there's no indicator of the critical mass of member states needed to endorse each or any of these proposals, and what it would take to make the platform truly effective. The countries that are leading these processes are generally countries in the global north, leading in the G7 and G20, and it's unclear whether they've gotten the buy-in from LMICs that would need to be leading this process. Secondly, given the intended capacities of this platform, it's essential that the platform have control over a smaller continuous pot of resources, similar to the way that multilateral agencies are funded, to accelerate R&D of countermeasures that are not prioritized by pharmaceutical companies due to issues of profitability, and B, over a larger pot of surge financing of accelerated development and truly equitable delivery of countermeasures against an outbreak to prevent a more expansive and longer pandemic. The surge financing should sustain regular contributions to build up resources that could move quickly in the event of an outbreak, most likely through a new pre-established mechanisms via development finance institutions. In addition, member states and expert stakeholders at the Pandemic Accord discussions are calling for a new global financial mechanism to finance pandemic response. As this platform develops, it should be consulting widely to ensure fit and synergies within proposed financing mechanisms and existing financing mechanisms, including but not limited to the Pandemic Fund, the Global Fund, UNITAID, and others. Utilization of all of these funding pots should be overseen by the proposed governance model, which should provide checks and balances on prioritization and allocation. Thirdly, one of the biggest problems with the ACT-A platform was that it was based on a vertical approach by product: vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. Without a thematic approach, the platform will struggle to operate and meet its stated goal of accelerating equitable development, distribution, and delivery of medical countermeasures for pandemics. We have proposed several different working groups that would try to address these gaps, including clinical trials and R&D, policy and regulatory barriers, open science licensing and technology transfer, supply chain procurement and regional manufacturing, health system integration, and people-centered community-based service delivery, and gender, human rights, vulnerability, and equity. These working groups were really missing in Act A, and it meant that the end-to-end system that is being proposed by this platform couldn't be ensured. There was no linkages to upmarket R&D, no linkages to where companies were seeking regulatory approval and whether they were doing it in all markets broadly, no linkages to how things would be delivered on the ground in the different situations and different contexts that things were being delivered in. For example, there are many countries where women are staying at home most of the time, and having to go to a centralized clinic to get vaccinated wouldn't be happening. And there was also no linkages to trying to get tech transfer to companies that had the manufacturing capacity but weren't allowed to manufacture the supply of vaccines and other medical countermeasures. Yeah, and so in Article 13 now, the text is very limited and basically proposes what already had existed in Act A. It proposes just a body that will be coordinating and monitoring supply and where the supply is going, which is just wholly ineffective and not enough of a change to actually make the equity goals real. And mostly it needs a complete overhaul if it's going to have any of the details that would make this platform really effective. And it doesn't have any details on whether it will be financed, any details on the governance structure, any details on how the platform would leverage procurement and direct procurement so that it could get equitable delivery of medical countermeasures in the event of a pandemic. So a lot more needs to be done on that. Sorry. And we're wondering whether the member states are trying to just punt it through the conference of parties like other articles, or if they're actually going to meaningfully engage with this process in this accord. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sam. That was really good and extremely on time. I still don't see any hands up. Does it mean that I can give Courtney the remaining of the 17 minutes? I think so. Courtney, floor is yours.
Great. I promise not to take 17 minutes on this. Yeah, so I'm just going to quickly speak to the sort of civil society community sort of engagement participation piece. I think the main message at this stage is obviously that the process so far is failing to meaningfully engage civil society communities in this process. Participation at the minute is obviously based on whether organizations are already in official relation with WHO, which is a very lengthy process, or if your organization's been identified as a relevant stakeholder, which requires sort of member state approval in the work of the IMB. So it is very limited, even when you are identified in one of those two categories. As we saw at IMB 7 a couple of weeks ago, we could attend for the first day in person for the first time in the process, but couldn't attend for the rest of the week. You can be in the building, but you can't be in the room to hear what's happening. And you're able to make a statement, but that needs to be maximum 90 seconds, as well as being able to submit a sort of 500-word written statement. I'm hopefully going to share my screen. And so I just wanted to quickly share some work that was done earlier this year by Save the Children and Stop AIDS. It was a briefing exactly on this around participation, looking at other processes, appreciating that there's one other process at WHO, but there's lots of examples across the UN system in human rights and environmental spaces, which actually show that this way of working isn't the way it has to be. There are better examples. And so we have this briefing, and I will pop the link into the chat after. And there's also a great briefing from the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, which has very similar messages, which again, I'll share, that again highlights other better practices that there are out there and kind of like key elements. And so just quickly on the 3 recommendations, we're around sort of including civil society communities in the negotiation and drafting process with sort of transparent accreditation processes, timely access to all the documents, as well as being able to intervene in a timely and unrestricted way throughout the whole process. And again, on these slides, I'm happy to share them. Like we've put the examples that are included in both the policy brief and the research paper, where we do see these kind of better practices as well. The second one was sort of looking ahead to governance and the conference of parties that's proposed. So again, looking at the framework on tobacco control and other sort of environmental agreements, making sure that sort of civil society are able to participate in that conference of parties. Based on previous examples, I think the text at the minute is looking like it will go that similar way. The actual details around CSO participation are generally found in the kind of rules of procedures that are then determined once the accord's already in place. So again, it's sort of already in there around participation, but it is something that over the next few months will need to be sort of guarded and make sure that does actually stay in the main text as we move into the final negotiation stages. And then the third recommendation was just around obviously inclusion within the monitoring and compliance mechanisms. Again, I think given where negotiations are, I don't know if these are kind of topics that will come up shortly or kind of in 2024. But again, when they are discussed and making sure that we do have those kind of accountability mechanisms, wanting to make sure that there's sort of designated seats for civil society delegates and the ability to input into those processes. And sort of in terms of that's sort of very process focused in terms of the governance and the negotiation processes. There's also obviously the actual text of the accord at the kind of national level as well. There's a lot of sort of recommendations around whole of society, whole of government, and making sure that we're moving away from encouraging member states to actually ensuring that member states commit to these inclusive processes where we see civil society and communities being able to meaningfully engage. Two things I want to very quickly flag, sort of looking ahead. One is there is a statement, which I will also put into the chat, that's open for sign-on. It's based on the recent experiences of IMB 7 and a lot of advocacy that's happened over the year and a half to try and push for better participation. The statement just outlines, you know, next year is a really crucial year, looking at where member states are, like really making the case that like we really need to see civil society communities, those organizations that you're identifying as relevant stakeholders, they need to be in the room to be able to support this process. And also making sure that the IMB also supports that engagement, because we get the notice quite late that we can be there in person. It's dependent on whether you already have a visa, if you need one to be able to get to Geneva. And also it's expensive for organizations to be regularly traveling to these meetings. So just to make sure that there's some kind of support mechanism in place to support that broader engagement. So I'll put that statement into the chat. And as I said, it's open, I think, until Monday for sign on. And then the second thing, which I guess is more of a question that I'm hoping we can kind of come to, is just around how a civil society, where we do have those sort of limited spaces at the moment, how can we best use that to ensure that we're engaging our broader networks as well. So there are a number of us who have either relevant stakeholder or unofficial relation status. There's a number of groups like this Coalition on Global Health and Pandemic Preparedness. Ben mentioned the Civil Society Alliance on Human Rights and the Pandemic Treaty as well. So how can we use these spaces and how can we come together to kind of develop what we want to see in terms of those recommendations and getting down to kind of where are the like key things that we want to get over to member states within the next couple of months, and how can we better coordinate between those groups, recognizing also that we've covered a lot in this discussion today, but there's also a lot of other areas where I think it's really key that we're coming together, for example, on financing. And I'm sure many others where can we create those spaces and what would be most helpful to facilitate that coordination between networks as well. So I'll finish there. Thanks, Quentin.
Thanks a lot, Courtney. Is there any questions for any of the panelists? So far I haven't seen any coming out of the attendees. Any hands up? While people try to overcome their shyness, I will open with a short question to Simon, because I want to hear from all of the panelists. It might take a second. So Simon, go ahead. Let me allow you to talk. There you go. Simon, you're still muted.
Oh, sorry. I was
No
reported. I think now I'm audible. Good morning, everyone. Yes, mine is just it's just a question. I don't know whether it's at a right place now to ask, but I was just trying to imagine the thinking around around the PPR, and actually going to the global health policies. Now I was just thinking here around trying to question myself, just coming up with a question as like, how now can a global health policies now be enhanced and strengthened, ensuring that there is more effectiveness in terms of coordinations approach toward this PPPR, and especially looking in terms of the country, because every country have now looking in terms of responding to the terms of pandemic responses. You can find that every country have like, there is no a clear modality in terms of the approach. Now going to looking at the global perspectives now, how now the global health policies can be looking in terms of maybe strengthened or enhanced to ensure that there is a clear coordination in terms of approaching the pandemic preparedness response at a large scale. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Simon. I'm gonna to get a perspective from everyone on the panel. Can I ask you, and perhaps we'll go in by speaking order. What do you see as the one, your favorite, your top measure in terms of impact in ensuring that we're better prepared for the next pandemic, out of a pandemic accord? To build up on Simon's question, Benjamin, can I put you on the spot first?
Happy to begin to respond to Simon's question and think about how we can move the agenda forward. And human rights provides, at a conceptual level, a very helpful way of ensuring that we're not just talking about the pandemic treaty. And this panel has begun focusing on the pandemic treaty or accord. It's begun thinking about the IHR. We've talked about WTO, but we also realize that there are One Health issues that need to be addressed across the quadripartite. There are ways in which the UN can begin to continue to support PPRR through its high-level meetings, and human rights provides a common set of norms. So we need to make sure that we're highlighting what the human rights issues are in this reform, and then make sure that we align the human rights across the series of reforms that will take place, ideally in parallel with or following the pandemic accord and the COPs that follow. So we are always using the same language, we are always using the same norms, we are always using the same principles, and we're making sure that we're not just talking about human rights in one institution, but across global health governance. I'll end there.
Thanks a lot. Rachel, can I call on you next?
Yeah, hi. I think there's many, but I think one of the key issues for me is this idea of governments using the leverage that they have in their own funding for R&D and for purchasing to ask for better. And I think it's not a silver bullet, it's only public funding. It doesn't deal with everything, of course. However, if the accord is member states essentially agreeing with each other what they will do, what they can do. That's what the accord is. And if member states aren't even willing to say, when we fund stuff, when we have leverage, we're going to ask for better, we're going to put these conditions in. If they can't even do that at this point, then what's the point? So I think this is a real opportunity to be able to ask for better, to expect better, and to set the norms in the way that or expectations of how this will go in the next pandemic. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Rachel. And sorry, Cedric, do you wanna go next, or do you want me to skip you? Sorry, I just sent your message in the chat.
No, I think one of the things maybe that would rather consider is that how
this QR code to confirm you are.
Was that coming from my laptop? No. Yeah, and I was going to say maybe for Simon, one of the things to consider, that the question that has been on the table of many is that we see this engagement at a global level, and then for us here, we can also speak about key issues, and then we can also follow the development of the agreement at many stages and get this kind of discussions in many spaces. But the question is how country themselves internally these discussions are happening, because we know whatever is influenced at the global level, we have to be translating into country level discussions and implementation. But we also know this is not really something that we can say is happening at many level. I guess maybe it's the question will be for us, or maybe our other colleagues in civil society, how can we really push the discussions also to happen at the country level, looking into country interests beyond what is being negotiated, for instance, at the WHO, INB. So that would be my point. I think it's really missing. We are not having this kind of discussion at the country level, and the connection is really missing in a way that we probably see opportunities because they are already created, but at global level, but we don't have this opportunity at the country level. And I think that the impact will be seen as soon as we have any agreement. Yeah.
Thanks, Cedric. Gopal, do you want to go next?
No, not at this stage.
All right, and Sam or Courtney, do you want to add something? And otherwise, we'll take one more question.
Sure. I'll just say that what I'm really looking for in this negotiation process is for Global South countries to come together and use their position to leverage what they want to see. For example, we know that the Global North countries really want agreements on data and pathogen sharing to make it mandatory. And Global South countries have so far been really good at holding up and saying, that's great. We would like to do that. That is in terms of solidarity, but we need solidarity both ways. In order to have data and pathogen sharing, we need to have that access to what is developed from that. We need to have some sort of ownership from it, using sort of, the same playbook that's been used of, well, we have ownership over these vaccines, we have ownership over these medicines, so we decide where they go. Global South countries can say, we have ownership over these pathogens. If you want to not treat things like global public goods, we can do that. We have ownership over these pathogens, and we'll decide whether you get to access to them to develop medical countermeasures or not. So that's what I'm looking for.
Thanks, Sam. And finally, Courtney.
Thanks. I think just picking up on Cedric's point, I think just, we talk around like this kind of WHO space kind of process and these agreements that member states will come together. But, we are very much approaching the kind of May 24 deadline of, if that is met and we do have the accord, what happens then? Like, how is this actually going to be taken forward by member states? How are we going to make sure that there's accountability? How are we going to make sure that communities are at the center of those responses and the oversight of that? And I do think as civil society networks as well, I think as we very quickly approach the end of the year, as we go into the next year, I think that is something to start thinking about and planning to make sure that, that we don't just have this point at which the accord's done, but actually what happens with it next and how is it taken forward as well. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Courtney. Okay, we actually are out of time. I don't see any other hands up in the chat. I really want to thank all of the panelists for joining us today for really insightful conversations. I think it's really hard to keep the conversations about those global agreements that are approachable because they're really technical. And I really want to thank you all for doing a great job at that. It was really interesting, really insightful. We hope to keep that series of webinar going. We're not completely sure yet what we want to focus on for the next one, probably early in the new year, perhaps civil society engagement, perhaps financing. But we're really looking forward to have a lot of you back. And I really want to thank all of the attendees for sticking with us for the whole 90 minutes. And we hope to see many of you again next time around.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.